Hello and welcome to Heads Up for Healthier Brains. This is a four-part video series. This is video 1 of 4, and it is, as you see, the title is Normal Aging versus Not Normal Aging. My name is Erica Rice and I'm an education coordinator at the Alzheimer's Society of Simcoe County. We do this series in person, have been doing it for a number of years. But of course, with the pandemic, we have decided to create this video content so that people can watch the series from home. In this series, the first video, as I mentioned, is normal aging versus not normal aging. So in this video, I will be discussing what is dementia and talking about the warning signs that we look for when it's maybe not a normal part of aging, because dementia is not considered a normal part of aging. So lots of people ask me, how do I know when changes that I might be experiencing is just part of getting older or when it's cause for more concern? So I will be going through those warning signs. I will be talking kind of an overview of the different risk factors for dementia, but the next 3 videos will be talking about ways to reduce those risk factors. So video 2 will be talking about giving your brain some exercise, so talking about building that cognitive reserve, getting your brain engaged and learning new things. Also the importance of physical activity for your brain health. Video 3 is all about food and looking at our diet and how our diet impacts our brain health. And our 4th video in the series is social engagement and stress management. So we do know that being socially engaged is very important for a healthy brain, as well as managing our stress. And of course, as I'm recording this at the end of 2020, this is certainly big topics that we've been dealing with this year as people are feeling very isolated because of the pandemic, and there's a lot of stress resulting from the pandemic as well. So we'll be talking about that in the 4th video. So one thing that we do want you to consider right off the bat, because when we do the Heads Up for Healthier Brains series, we often get asked questions about research findings that people see in the news, often on social media. And so I want to say just at the start to consider a few things around research. First of all, what is that source of the information? So when you see it on social media, you have to be very careful about where is that information coming from. In this course, a lot of the research findings that we offer are from the World Health Organization and from the Lancet Commissions in the UK, so very reputable sources, and it's also very current, so you'll see, well, how old is the research? With the Lancet Commission, they just updated their findings in 2020, so we're using that information. The World Health Organization came out with their risk reduction guidelines for dementia in 2019, so also very current. Sometimes over time, things that we thought were risk factors in the past are then proven not to be a risk factor. And one in particular is aluminum. A number of years ago, people thought that aluminum was a cause for Alzheimer's disease, and that's no longer considered a risk factor any longer. So how old is that research that you're looking at? We also want to consider who funded the research, and just to be careful, not to say that the research isn't valid, but if the funder is benefiting from the findings, you want to really be careful about how the research study was conducted. Are there other studies that support the findings and so on? And also look at where in the research trial are they? Is it promising or is it conclusive? So research can take a long time, and sometimes, especially with some of the drug treatments out there for Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementia, there's been a number of drugs that have been in trials, looked very promising, but did not pass all the phases of the drug trial. So at some point along the way, it was determined that it was not an effective treatment. So sometimes we'll hear something saying, this is it, this is going to be the cure for dementia, for Alzheimer's disease, and it ends up not being the case. So we want to just be careful, where in the trial are they? So if we're talking about keeping our brain healthy, it's good to first look at how our brain works. We tend to take our brains for granted. It does all these amazing things for us, and we don't even really pay attention to it. It just kind of does it in the background. But when you think about this brain of ours, it's organic matter just like the rest of our body. And just like any other part of our body, it is susceptible to disease like Alzheimer's disease. But our brain is about small. It's about 3 pounds. If you're a 150-pound person, that's about 2% of your body mass. It's the size of your 2 fists put together, approximately. It has billions of specialized nerve cells in it called neurons, and these neurons have the potential to make trillions of connections. And it's through these connections that we're able to think and feel and organize and use language and access memories and store memories and tell our body how to move and all of those amazing things that our brain does. When our neurons want to talk to each other in the chain, it creates a bit of electricity, which is why you see that electricity sparkling around this brain. So then the neuron has an electrical charge, which then helps it release some chemicals called neurotransmitters from one neuron to the next neuron in the chain. And this is how our brain talks. Those neurons talk to each other in order to do these things. When you have a neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's disease, we start to have some problems. So first of all, we see those neurons start to die off. So we start having breaks in the chain. But there can also be problems with the chemical interaction. So changes in the chemical, the neurotransmitters in the brain that make it difficult for those neurons to talk to each other. And there's a lot of things that we can do to help keep our brain healthy, keep those neurons healthy, and keep that chemical messaging happening the way that it should. And that's what we're going to really be talking about in Heads Up for Healthier Brains, is all the lifestyle things that we can do to maximize how amazing and how healthy our brain is. When you think about your brain and what it does for you too, because we do tend to take it for granted. And when we talk about dementia, it's important to really think about all the things that our brain does. When you think about just getting up in the morning, when you first open up your eyes, how do you know that it's time to get up? Well, usually if you're like me, you might wake up 2 or 3 times during the night. So first of all, recognizing that this might not be time to get up. And then I'm going to look at my clock or my watch. I have to register that visual information that I see, that time, and then I have to be able to recognize what that means. So if I see on my watch that it's 2:30, I have to be able, my brain is what is able to recognize that visual data and say it's 2:30, and then make the connection to say, well, it's not time to get up yet, go back to sleep. Your brain, when you first get up in the morning, maybe you need to use the washroom. So your brain is what's able to recognize sensory information that your body is sending. Like, my bladder is full and I need to take care of that. What do I do with this information? If you like to have a cup of coffee in the morning, well then, where's the coffee maker and how does it work? What are the steps involved in making that cup of coffee? Being able to recognize the visual information of the coffee maker and know what it is, to remember how you use it. Maybe you're talking to family members in the morning, so being able to think about the thoughts that you want to express and finding the words that will express that thought for you, knowing how to put those words in order, and then actually moving the muscles in your mouth and your face in order to say those words. Or even just being able to swing yourself off your bed and walk down the hall, being able to direct your body to move in that way. That's your brain working for you as well. So there's so many things that our brain does for us, just to allow us to get through every moment of our lives, and we tend to take that for granted. But when we start to have a disease like Alzheimer's disease impacting how that brain works, then we start to see a lot of changes occurring. And it's a lot more than just memory. We tend to think that Alzheimer's is all about memory. And yes, that's true. Memory is definitely affected with that disease, but it's about so much more, because it's about the brain is failing. And if our brain does all this amazing stuff for us, all of this can start to be affected when we have a disease like Alzheimer's disease or one of the many other neurodegenerative diseases out there. We're talking about dementia, and dementia is not considered a normal part of aging. So how do you know when changes that you're experiencing is just part of getting older and a healthy part of normal aging, and when it could be something else, and when to be concerned? So I will be going through the 10 warning signs, but I want to start off with a little bit of an example here to get you thinking about that. So here we have Rosemary. Rosemary's in her early 70s. She has no major health problems and is in pretty good spirits, but she is starting to have some memory changes. She's starting to misplace things a fair bit, and that's causing frustration. She's starting to forget the names of people that she's met, even people that she's known for a long time, and that's also causing her some frustration. Learning new things is getting more difficult, even if it's something that she's been doing for a long time. So Rosemary has been a dancer most of her life, but now she's finding that learning new dance routines is getting more and more difficult than it was even 15, 20 years ago. And that's also causing her a bit of concern as well. But even though these things are a bit of a concern and an inconvenience to Rosemary, they aren't impacting her day-to-day life. So I just want you to think to yourself now whether you think that this is a normal part of healthy aging, or if you think that Rosemary should be concerned and look at investigating further to see if there's something else going on. So just consider that to yourself, and we're going to get back to Rosemary in a few slides. So as I mentioned, dementia is not a normal part of aging. So then what is dementia? Dementia is what we call an umbrella term. It's a term that describes common symptoms across a number of different diseases. There's approximately 100 different neurodegenerative diseases, the most common of which by far is Alzheimer's disease. All of these diseases affect how well the brain works. And so we talked about all the things that your brain does for you. Being able to use language and access memories and create memories and judgment and reasoning and being able to tell your body how to move and your emotions and all of those things. And so when you have a disease that is starting to impact the health of your brain, is starting to destroy those neurons, is starting to change the chemical interaction between those neurons, we can start to see changes in all of those different areas. So when we talk about somebody living with dementia, we're really saying that somebody is living with brain change. We're talking about the changes that are occurring more than the disease itself. The definition we typically give for dementia is that it describes a set of symptoms that do include often loss of memory. And with Alzheimer's disease, this is an early symptom. That's why we often think about dementia and Alzheimer's and memory all tied up together. But we also see loss of judgment and reasoning abilities. We see changes in mood and behavior, emotional changes. We see changes in language. We see changes in problem solving and being able to use abstract thinking and all of those different things. So that decline in cognitive functioning. So dementia is really about much more than just memory. Again, dementia is that umbrella term that describes common symptoms across a number of these different brain diseases. I like this definition of dementia myself. This is from Dr. Al Power, who is a geriatrician, has worked in dementia care for many, many years. And his definition of dementia is that it's a shift in the way a person experiences the world around him or her. When we think about our brain, it's our brain that gives us our experience of the world. It's our brain that tells us how we think and feel and understand what's going on around us and understand what people are saying to us and so on. And so when somebody is living with a brain disease, it's starting to shift the way that they experience the world around them. Doesn't mean that they are no longer able to interact with the world or appreciate what's going on, but it's going to start being different. And so for somebody who doesn't have dementia, it can start being that disconnect. I see the world in one way, and then somebody living with dementia sees the world in a different way. When we talk about dementia care, not that we're getting into that in this series, but just to say when we do education for family members and healthcare providers and so on, this is a really important concept that we have to start understanding what their experience is. If we're supporting a person living with dementia, how is their brain experiencing the world? And if we can get into their world, we're much better able to support that person. If we think of dementia as that umbrella term that describes symptoms across a number of different neurodegenerative diseases, underneath that umbrella are the most common diseases that we do see. Alzheimer's disease, as I mentioned, is by far the most common. Approximately 64% of people with dementia symptoms, it's a result of Alzheimer's disease. We do see with Alzheimer's, it does have a specific progression. It typically starts in the area of the brain that's responsible for creating memory. And that's why with Alzheimer's disease, we see short-term memory loss as one of the very earliest symptoms. The part of our brain, the hippocampus, its responsibility is to take the information that we're receiving from our five senses. For example, as you're watching this presentation, your brain is receiving the visual and auditory data, what you're seeing, what I'm saying, and it's consolidating it into memory so that you can access it again later on. And maybe some of this you'll remember and some you might not remember. It all depends on how your brain decides to record this information. But with Alzheimer's disease, This is the part of the brain that's affected earliest and starts receiving damage the earliest. And so people with Alzheimer's can start to have problems consolidating that information, forming the memory. And if your brain doesn't make the memory, it's like it didn't happen. So we start to see those short-term memory changes. Maybe somebody is repeating the same story over and over again without realizing it, or asking the same questions repeatedly without realizing it. And that's one of the first things that people start to recognize. And that's also where a lot of people have a bit of, like, is this just part of getting older, or is it something else that I should be more concerned about when we see those memory changes? But as with Alzheimer's disease, as with all of these types of neurodegenerative diseases, it is progressive in nature. So although it starts with those memory changes, over time, we start to see more and more brain regions affected and more of those changes with dementia starting to come into play. Language changes, emotional changes, being able to direct the body, how to move, planning, organizing, reasoning, judgment, all of those kinds of things. But we also have a number of other diseases that impact the brain. Frontotemporal dementia is one that we see often with people who are a bit younger than we typically see with Alzheimer's disease. And as the name suggests, it primarily affects our frontal lobe, which is the part of the brain behind your forehead, and the temporal lobes, which are on the side of your brains behind your temples. The frontal lobe, that part of your brain behind your forehead, its function is to, good judgment and reasoning. It's your filter. It's the part of your brain that stops those impulses. You might have a thought and your frontal lobe says, well, that's not a smart thing to do, or that's not a kind thing to say. And it keeps you from doing those kinds of things. And so with this disease, because it's impacting that frontal lobe, we start to see more disinhibition, more lack of judgment. Our temporal lobes are responsible for language, so we can also see some language changes with frontotemporal dementia. We also have Lewy body disease, and Lewy body disease is related to Parkinson's disease. It's actually the same disease process happening in the brain. But with Lewy body disease, it's impacting our cognitive regions of the brain at the same time or before the motor areas of the brain. But we do see some similarities with Parkinson's disease as well as with Lewy body. Vascular dementia, and we'll talk a lot in this course about the connection between our heart and our brain. Our heart health and our brain health are so tied together. Our brain, as I mentioned earlier, is only 2% of our body mass, but it actually takes 20 to 25% of our blood flow. So when we have problems with our vascular system, we have problems getting our blood flow to the brain, it can start to cause damage in our brain. And if you receive enough damage, we'll start to see those changes that we call dementia. Depending on where the damage is occurring in the brain with the vascular changes, will determine what kinds of dementia symptoms we're experiencing. So it might not be memory changes in the beginning. It might be something like problems with reasoning. It might be problems with language. It might be something else. It depends on where the vascular damage is starting to occur. But as with the other diseases, vascular dementia is also progressive. If we can manage the vascular issues well, it can actually be a very slow progression. But if we do see some of the vascular, if it's not managed well, then it can be a quicker progression. And you can have more than one type of disease happening in the brain at the same time, which is what we call mixed dementia. And most commonly, vascular changes in Alzheimer's disease. So somebody might have the main diagnosis of vascular dementia, but if you were to look at their brain, they would also have the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. And if you see somebody with the main diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, there's likely going to be some vascular changes happening as well. So that's what we term mixed dementia. I'm going to go through now what we call the 10 warning signs. And these signs, as I say, warning signs, so cautionary signs that maybe there's something beyond normal aging occurring. They are not meant to make a diagnosis. I would say if you recognize any of these warning signs in yourself or in someone that you care for, the first step is always to go and talk about them with your doctor. And if your doctor feels that further investigation is required, then there's quite a process to getting a specific diagnosis of dementia. But it's good to know what to be aware of or what to look out for as far as changes. So the first one is memory loss, and we do start to see memory changes as we get older. That's a normal part of aging. Just like, as I said, your brain is part of your body, and just like the rest of your body, it starts to slow down as we get older. I'm guessing you probably can't run and jump and play like you did when you were a kid. We can't process information as quickly as we did when we were younger. So it does start to slow down, but our brain is able to create and retain memory. It just might take longer to pull that memory back out again. When it's something like Alzheimer's disease, it's more of a problem of trying to get that memory to stick in the first place. And that's why we often see people with Alzheimer's disease repeating themselves a lot, maybe asking the same questions over and over again, or telling the same stories over and over in a short period of time. So those kinds of things, if you see that happening, might warrant further investigation. Again, if you are able, if it's more that you're having trouble pulling out a memory, something happened, I'm trying to remember that that appointment, maybe you forgot the appointment because you got busy, but when the doctor's office called to tell you you forgot the appointment, the memory of having made the appointment comes back to you. That's normal aging. If you forgot about it all entirely, and when the doctor's office calls, you had no recollection of ever having made that appointment, that might be more something that requires further investigation. The second one here, we say difficulty performing familiar tasks. An example might be, we just had Christmas, so I'm recording this just before New Year's. And a lot of people at Christmas time have traditions, things that they've done for years and years and years. Sometimes people will say that the first warning sign that they had something was changing for, say, one of their parents was at a family dinner, because mom has always made the turkey dinner for years with no problem, and now this year she was having difficulty with it. Not sure what ingredients to use, maybe forgetting ingredients entirely, struggling to try to put that turkey together and all the fixings and so on. So those are kind of things that we're looking out for. That can be a warning sign as well. Problems with language. We all have trouble trying to find words from time to time. I mean, I'm having trouble right now as I'm recording this. But when it starts to impact daily conversations, really struggling to find the names of things, maybe having trouble comprehending, so having trouble hearing the words that other people are saying and understanding what the meaning of those words are, and that's not related to hearing loss. It's more of a processing issue. Those can be warning signs that there's something going on. Disorientation of time and place. And this is where people living with dementia are at high risk of going missing. Our brain is able to take in the sensory data. So as I mentioned earlier, we're receiving data from our 5 senses. What we see and what we hear is smell, touch, and taste. But when you think about when you're out in your community and how you navigate around, you're taking in data, usually visual data, what you see, and your brain is able to connect it with memories. I've been here before. This is where I turn to go to the grocery store. This is the route I take to go home. And if in the moment your brain is having trouble accessing the memories you need in order to navigate in the community, you can become disoriented in place. And this is where people living with dementia can suddenly be even in a familiar location and not know where they are, how they got there, and how to get home. And so it can be a great risk for going missing. We can also have that disorientation of time. If you're having trouble remembering or accessing current memories, you might say or do things that's not consistent with the current here and now. Maybe somebody who's living with dementia might say something like they want to go visit a friend, but that friend passed away 3 months ago, but they're not remembering that experience. And so in their mind, that friend is still alive and they want to go and visit them. That's an example of disorientation of time. That's not usual with normal aging. So this certainly, if this is occurring, definitely something you want to go talk to the doctor about. We talk about poor and decreased judgment. Some people, all of these warning signs are like a change from what's normal for the person. So some people have never had good judgment, so not having good judgment probably isn't a warning sign for dementia. But if somebody has usually made good decisions and has had good judgment and now they're not making good decisions, so this is a change for them, then that could be something that you want to talk to the doctor about. The next example we have is problems with abstract thinking. And in the picture we have on the slide, this is often what we see with problems with abstract thinking. So people are starting to have trouble paying their bills. When we hear from care partners, family members, this is often one of the first things that they've noticed with a family member who's living with dementia, is that they've discovered a stack of unpaid bills, or maybe have gotten some calls from utility companies saying that bills haven't been paid. Managing your finances requires a lot of that abstract thinking, knowing how much is due, how to pay those bills, what the due date is, keeping track of how much money's in the account, and so on. So I also like to use an example, problems with abstract thinking, to connect back to one of the other warning signs I mentioned in the previous slide, which is problems with familiar tasks. So we often have card players in our groups, and you think about some of the card groups, for example, a bridge foursome that's been playing together for years. Bridge requires a great deal of abstract thinking. So maybe a member of that bridge foursome is now not being a very good bridge player any longer, and that's a change in the familiar task. And so the other members of the group are recognizing that things are not changing, because usually they make proper moves, and now things are not happening the way it should. But this is occurring because of problems with abstract thinking. So these warning signs can kind of mesh into each other. The next one here is misplacing things, and we all misplace things. With normal aging, it's more about not paying attention to where we put the item. Maybe you came in with the car keys, and normally you hang them up on the hook beside the door, but your arms were full, or you were thinking about something else, and so you place the car keys in your coat pocket or on the table or the counter or wherever. And so when you go to find them, you're not sure where you put them because they're not on the hook like they should be. When it's something like dementia, you certainly misplace things, but sometimes the thing that you misplace is in a place that doesn't make sense. There used to be a commercial from the Alzheimer's Society with those car keys that were in the sugar bowl. And that was to reinforce this change, that we all misplace our car keys from time to time, but we wouldn't find those car keys in a place like the sugar bowl. That is certainly a cause for concern. So that's kind of the difference with the misplacing things, is when you find that item, it's in a place that just doesn't make sense. The next one's a change in mood and behavior, and change in personality, and again, change for the person. So this is, I think, fairly self-explanatory. Loss of initiative. For dementia, it's more about the brain being able to get started on a task initiation. And so our brain just can't get going on something. So a person might look like they're happy or just wanting to sit there and not do anything, but it's just their brain can't get started on whatever it is that they want to do. These symptoms can look very similar to depression, and certainly people with dementia can also have depression as well. So want to, with any of these warning signs, to be aware, and if you can, even keep a journal about the changes to share with your doctor or other members of the healthcare team. That kind of information that you provide is really important for the healthcare team to make an accurate diagnosis. And if there is depression on top of the dementia, or if it is depression that's causing these changes, to be able to recognize that and treat that, because depression is a treatable illness, whereas dementia is a progressive illness that we have not found a way to ways to treat or ways to stop the progression. So if we're getting back to Rosemary and wondering if this is normal aging or not normal aging, think back to what you thought at the first slide and consider whether you would change your answer, or whether it's a confirmation of what you thought, whether it was normal aging or not normal aging. And so yes, with Rosemary, this is an example of a normal, healthy aging. As we get older, we do start to have changes with our memory. We start to forget people's names, have a harder time retaining those names. But in that example with Rosemary, if she gave herself time, it would come back. So as I mentioned earlier, with normal aging, it's more about recalling memory. With a disease like Alzheimer's disease, it becomes a problem with recording or encoding that memory, getting it to stick. We start to slow down that processing speed, so learning new dance routines, it's going to take longer, but you can still do it. With something like a dementia, it's not to say you can't learn new things, but it becomes much, much more difficult when you're dealing with that kind of disease. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the risk factors for dementia. We all have some risk factor for dementia because there are these three things that are beyond our control. First of all, we can't stop getting older. Age is the biggest risk factor for dementia. We are living much longer lives than we used to, even a generation ago. We're getting better at keeping the body going, but we have a ways to go yet to keep the brain healthy as well. We do see here in the statistics from the Canadian Institute for Health Information that about 25% of Canadians 85 and over are living with dementia. Mostly this is the result of a lifetime of lifestyle factors that accumulate into the brain and kind of overcome the brain's ability to repair itself. So there's a lot that we can do to reduce our risk so that when we get to that age, it's more likely that we'll still be cognitively well. And that's what we're going to be covering in the next 3 videos. But it's still true, like the longer you live, the more likely it is that those risk factors are going to overcome our brain's health and develop dementia. So the next one is gender, and women do account for more dementia cases, and we're still trying to figure out exactly why this is. Part of this could be because women still outlive men. Life expectancy for women is higher than men, and if age is the biggest risk factor, then this could be part of the reason why more women than men are living with dementia. So you'll see here 60% of all dementia cases and 72% of all Alzheimer's disease cases are women. There are some longitudinal studies, so these are studies that take place over many, many years that are looking at other risk factors that could be part of this, including things like hormones and stress and so on. But those kinds of studies are still occurring. And the third one is family history. With Alzheimer's disease, we have 2 types, sporadic, which is the most common form. With sporadic, it's mostly a combination of our environment and lifestyle factors, so we do have some control over that. Age, which we don't have control over, but as I mentioned, age is the biggest risk factor. You do have a risk factor with genes. So if you do have a parent or a sibling, like a direct relative who's had Alzheimer's disease, it does tip your scale a bit. So it increases the risk factor for dementia, or for Alzheimer's disease, but it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. It's not a causal factor. For a very small percentage, it is a causal factor, and this is what we call familial Alzheimer's disease. This is a mutated gene that actually cranks out the protein that accumulates and causes Alzheimer's disease. So with the familial one, people usually start showing the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease much earlier in life than you normally would with the sporadic type of the disease. So they'll start showing symptoms maybe in their 40s or 50s, sometimes even earlier than that. If you've ever seen the movie Still Alice or read the book Still Alice by Lisa Genova, you know the main character in that book, she has this type of Alzheimer's disease where she inherited it from her father, and it's causing this cranking out of that beta amyloid, which is the protein that accumulates with Alzheimer's disease, and she starts showing symptoms, I think, around the age of 50. And you'll see clearly in the family tree other family members who have started to have Alzheimer's disease quite early in life. But there are a lot of things that we do control. So if we can't control age, gender, and family, there are a lot of things that we do have control over. And as I mentioned, heart health and brain health are very closely tied together. So the first thing that we have some control over is cardiovascular disease. And I'm sure you've heard all of the heart health messages from the Heart and Stroke Foundation and so on about the importance of exercise and healthy diet and not smoking and stress management. And we'll say all of those are also true for our brain health. So we're going to be talking about like brain healthy and heart healthy diet go hand in hand. Managing stress is really important. Getting exercise is really important for reducing risk for dementia as well. So we'll have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, all of these are all tied together. The other type of disease, chronic disease, that can really impact the risk for dementia is type 2 diabetes. So So a lot of the risk factors for diabetes, type 2 diabetes, are also risk factors for dementia. So controlling these diseases, if you do have them, is really important for your brain health. So making sure that you're controlling your heart health, controlling your blood pressure, cholesterol numbers, blood sugar, and so on. So obesity, which can lead to risk factors of these diseases as well, then becomes another risk factor for dementia. Lack of physical activity. Next week, we'll be talking about the importance of physical activity, because what's good for your heart is good for your brain. We want to keep the blood flowing to the brain. We are also seeing that lower levels of formal education, especially earlier in life, can lead to an increased risk of dementia later in life. And this leads to what we call cognitive reserve. We will be talking more next week about building our cognitive reserve. It's giving the brain more connections between those neurons. And when the brain has more connections, it has more to work with. It has more routes to move around damage that might occur in the brain. So we do see that the more formal education somebody has, the more protective factor it has in the brain. Another risk factor that is certainly a concern right now is social isolation. And so in the fourth video, we'll be talking about the importance of social connection. And that's certainly a challenge right now. We'll also be talking about the importance of sleep. So there's new evidence coming out to show that when we're not getting proper night's sleep, it can increase the risk of dementia, because our brain is not having the opportunity to do the maintenance work that it's supposed to do, to clear out the metabolic gunk that's been accumulating all day and doing some of that repair work. So it's important to get a proper night's sleep. Inadequate exercise for the brain. Again, this is about building our cognitive reserve. We'll be talking more about that in the next video. Smoking, of course, heart health and smoking go together. Excessive alcohol consumption. There's actually a certain type of dementia that is directly related to excessive alcohol consumption. Stress. So we'll be talking about in video 4 the importance of managing our stress. And of course, stress with heart health is, they go hand in hand, but also stress and depression. So depression that's not controlled can increase the risk for dementia. And this is another new one from the Lancet Commission, hearing loss in midlife, and they're showing that it's actually a fairly high risk factor. So this is hearing loss that is not corrected. So if somebody's having hearing loss in midlife and they're not going to an audiologist and getting hearing aids and taking care of that, that's where the risk comes into play. Head injuries. A head injury at any point in life can increase the risk for dementia, and certainly the more head injuries, the greater the risk. Dehydration can also cause some changes. Here we have some potentially modifiable risk factors from the Lancet Commission. The Lancet is a medical journal out of the UK, a very reputable journal, and they looked at many different studies worldwide looking at risk factors for dementia. And what they found are there are 12 potentially modifiable risk factors that can account for almost 40% of dementia cases worldwide. And those risk factors, as I mentioned in the previous slide, lower levels of education, and that's an early life risk factor. So the more education that people get earlier in their life, if they finish school and go on to college and university and so on, it has a protective factor for later in their life. In midlife, those risk factors, hearing loss, traumatic brain injury, hypertension, excessive alcohol use, obesity. So if we can address those risk factors, that can reduce the risk for dementia. And in later life too, stopping smoking, managing depression, social isolation can be a risk factor. So that's an important one right now. We see a lot of seniors, older adults who are isolated because of the pandemic. So how do we address that? Physical inactivity. A new one, air pollution. So you're finding that people who live in larger cities with more air pollution have a higher risk of dementia. And diabetes as well. So managing diabetes if that is an issue. The important message is that your brain is an organ just like the rest of our body. We want to keep our heart healthy and our joints healthy and everything else healthy. We need to keep our brain healthy. It needs to be looked after. I don't like to say that dementia can be prevented, but we can reduce the risk. There's no guarantees because there are some things that we have no control over. But there's a lot of things that we do have some control over. So healthy lifestyle choices helps to tip the scale a little bit. Well, actually can tip the scale quite a bit. So if we really look after keeping our brain as healthy as possible, then we can reduce that risk as we age. So in the next 3 videos, we'll be talking about lifestyle factors and giving you some thought about what you can do in your life in order to keep your brain as healthy as possible. I've talked a little bit about cognitive reserve, and we'll talk more in the next video about the importance of cognitive engagement. Cognitive reserve is building your brain's neural network, more pathways for your brain to use. If your brain is full, billions of those neurons in your brain, those billions of neurons have the potential to make trillions of connections. And the more connections your brain has, the more it has to work with. And a good example is, if you're going down to Toronto, you have a plane to catch at Pearson and you're heading down the 400 and there's an accident and now you're stuck. You're not going to make it there. But if you were able to get off the highway and find another route to get to the airport, your chances of getting to your destination have greatly improved. So the more routes that you have to get around damage, the more ability your brain has in order to get to its destination. We can actually see in the brains of some people who did not have any dementia symptoms when they were alive. And remember, dementia symptoms are brain changes. It's the actual outward expression of changes, like memory changes and language changes and so on. But when they looked at their brains after they died on autopsy, they found the pathology of Alzheimer's disease throughout the brain and thought, well, why is it that this person who obviously has Alzheimer's disease in their brain never actually experienced dementia while they were alive? And what their thought is the person had a high level of cognitive reserve. Their brain had more connections to use, more routes around the damage. So even though the Alzheimer's disease was happening in the brain was able to work around those damaged areas and still do what it needed to do. And that's why cognitive reserve is so important. And we build this cognitive reserve by learning new things and having new experiences, because this is when we get our brain to make new connections. If we just go over the same things we've always done already, we're strengthening the connections that are already there in the brain, but we're not making new ones. So the goal is to make some new connections for our brain to have more routes to work around damage that might occur. Normally in our in-person session, we would show a TED Talk by Lisa Genova here, which is a great TED Talk. And she talks about the importance of cognitive reserve. So we're going to try to put the link here with the video so that you can watch it yourself. But even if you just go to TED.com and type in Lisa Genova, you'll find it there. And it's a really great TED Talk. I do encourage you to go and watch that. Some key points to remember is that even if you have a number of risk factors, you looked at that slide where I listed all the risk factors that are there for dementia and you think, oh shoot, I've got this and this and this and this. It's never too late to make some changes to your lifestyle, to tip the scale a little bit, to reduce your risk. It's never too late. You're never too old to do some of those things. Cognitive reserve, again, helps your brain create routes around damage. It's never too late to build that cognitive reserve, and we do that through having new experiences and learning new skills. And most likely, when we look at the treatment for Alzheimer's disease, it's most likely going to be a preventative measure. Newer research that's come out in the last 5 to 10 years has shown that the pathology of Alzheimer's disease can start happening in the brain 15 to 20 years before you actually start seeing any outward signs, any dementia symptoms. And that the treatments that we've had up until this point have really been to people who are already showing dementia symptoms. And they're thinking that it's probably too late by that point, that they need to identify people that are starting to have that disease pathology in their brains long before they start showing dementia symptoms and intervene at that point earlier on. So that is most likely going to be what happens in the future. And right now, a big thing that researchers are looking at is to educate the public on the importance of brain health and keep our brains as healthy as it possibly can. So I do hope that you will continue with me for the next 3 videos in the series, and we can talk about about the importance of getting our brain and body in gear, and that will be in our next video.